The next stage of the BCA's high-level formula for delivering prosperity recognises the need to combine economic growth with work and community participation to deliver community prosperity. This aspect of the formula recognises that in addition to participation having a significant economic dimension, it also has a much wider community application. Workforce and community participation are essential dimensions to the wellbeing framework more generally. We've talked about Joseph Stiglitz's name has come up earlier this morning, but as many of you are aware, he, along with Amartya Sen and others, were commissioned by President Sarkozy to undertake a study on the measurement of economic performance and social progress. It's a very good report, and I'd recommend people read it. It highlights the multi-dimensional nature of wellbeing. There's just two points I'd like to draw out of that analysis, which I think are very relevant to a lot of the issues that we're discussing today. The Stiglitz Commission highlighted several essential points about the wider importance of workforce and community participation. Paid work matters for quality of life because it provides identity to people and opportunities to socialise with others. Education also matters for the quality of life, independently of its effects on people's earnings and productivity. Better educated people typically have better health status, lower unemployment, more social connections, and greater engagement in civic and political life. Having established the underpinnings of an approach to attaining community prosperity, there's obviously a final dimension, and that's to ensure that wellbeing is sustained over time. And I think Deborah is going to talk a bit about some of these intergenerational issues. The three-stage building blocks approach that I've just outlined, it does risk oversimplifying the problem, but I think it's intended to get across some of the key messages of the BCA. If we as a nation maintain a growing population and encourage fuller and productive participation in the workforce and in the community, and if we have the support of good quality health, education and infrastructure systems, we will go a long way to building a sense of shared prosperity. In outlining this high-level formula for delivering community prosperity and a better quality of life, we need to be mindful that significant overlap exists between business interests and interests of the national interest. And this key area of overlap is obviously around the issue of participation. Businesses cannot substitute the role of governments in the provision of social welfare, but they can make a difference by selectively using its resources, people and skills in adding value to community organisations. Businesses can and should aspire to building a better Australia in which to live, learn, work and do business. Business will better connect with the national interest by engaging on improving both the level of participation in education and training and the quality of outcomes. Business will connect with the national interest by continuing to create work opportunities. Business will connect if it engages in infrastructure and infrastructure planning, and it will connect with the national interest by engaging on health and healthcare reform. I'll just make two final comments. One, I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fundamental importance of generating wealth. It's only once wealth has been generated that it can be then redistributed. Last night I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations on the BCA membership. In 2009 we had 110 members. Their member companies generated $84 billion in profit. 27 billion of that was paid in tax. 35 billion of that was paid in dividends, and I'm guessing that around 22 billion was reinvested. Now, obviously, others will have a view about whether this has delivered a fair share, but on my reading, I reckon that's not a bad outcome overall. And just finally, I'd like to commend to you a terrific book written by Benjamin Friedman called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. And I do want to leave you with a couple of quotes from that book. Economic growth, more often than not, fosters greater opportunity, tolerance of diversity, social mobility, commitment to fairness and dedication to democracy. But economic progress needs to be broadly based if it's to foster social and political progress. That progress requires the positive experience of a sufficiently broad cross-section of a country's population to shape the national mood and direction. So on that note, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, that's a lot of food for thought there for me that I will think about. Let's go to our third panellist first, though, before we open up to questions. Rob Heferen is Deputy Secretary of the Federal Department of Families, Housing and Community Services and Indigenous Affairs, Jenny Macklin's portfolio. Rob was also head of the Henry Tax Review Secretariat, so there might be some questions along those lines too. Now, as Peter Crone pointed out, Australia has had nearly, 20 consecutive years of economic growth. Of course, that's boosted jobs, it's wages, educational opportunities, which in turn has boosted the wealth of most Australian households. One group, though, that hasn't shared in these benefits as equally is, of course, Indigenous Australians. Rob, I guess the question is, it's not like governments and policymakers and NGOs haven't been trying their hardest to close the gap, or is it a case that they've just not been trying hard enough? You'll take it from there?
Thank you, Sheryl. Yes, is this microphone on? Yes. I will take it from there. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It is quite remarkable, I think, in such a wealthy country that has had such growth that Peter pointed out has a persisting chronic disadvantage amongst a number of members of the community, but in particular those of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. A couple of things. People are probably aware of these sorts of stats, but and I know we don't want to read too much into the data, but what the data seem to say to us is that it's still the case Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men would expect to live 11 and a half years less than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women 9.7 years less. Following on from Andrew's presentation this morning, noting that whilst not comprehensive, indicators of reading, writing and numeracy are very important. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids in grade 3, grade 5, grade 7, grade 9, on average they score 20 to 30 points lower than their non-Indigenous counterparts, which is quite extraordinary, and it is not just a remote phenomenon. Bearing in mind around 75% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in urban and regional areas. So we really have to say, why is it the case? Has governments not been trying hard enough? I don't think that's true. This disadvantage, we need to be clear about what it is, have to have a compelling argument or compelling reasons about what the causes are, and then a coherent framework of what ought to be done. And I guess I do want to just reflect very quickly on action there. How does it butt up against what we consider to be a fair society? Do we look at outcome, or as Christopher urges, to opportunity? Or is actually that a false dichotomy? When we talk about opportunity, some people's opportunity is in fact so constrained that it's not actually a meaningful phrase. Do we like the notion of a higher average income and rely on some element of trickle down, both through improved productivity of the economy, but more explicitly through the transfer system operating, so having pensions indexed to male total average weekly earnings? Or do we just look at a narrow distribution, at least at the bottom? So you don't want the distribution to be as broad, we want to be much narrower. If I can just, remote Indigenous housing is something which is an awkward thing that if people read, I'm sure you'll do, read a range of newspapers, work for the Commonwealth and states and the Northern Territory, remote Indigenous housing is always under the spotlight. Now just recently, for the 2009-10 year, 316 new houses were built in remote Australia, 828 refurbishments. So new houses just a little bit under the target. The target was 320, 316. But the refurbishments 828 compared with the target of 587 in remote Indigenous communities across Australia, clearly making things better for some of the poorest and most vulnerable and some of the most marginalised in the community, but very explicitly Rawlsian in its nature. Is that the right framework? Or should we think about a more utilitarian framework which might lead governments to put their resources somewhere else? That's an open question.